Welcome to the Continuous Delivery Podcast. My name is Zarar.
I'm Csaba.
I'm Cheezy.
And today's topic is how to design or architect or think about your application when you know that you're going to be doing a lot of testing in production. And I know that testing in production seems like, oh my God, what are these guys doing? That's a horrible idea. But I mean, I think this sort of trend of removing your staging environments is catching up. And this week, there was a link on Hacker News by Squeaky.ai, which is a fairly, I think it's a pretty popular company, and they talked about how they got rid of their staging environment, and they talked about all the problems that exist with staging environments, like long queues and all that. And they go from local host to production. Basically, that's what their workflow is. Something which I think all three of us can generally agree with. So today, I kind of wanted to talk about what are some of the things that you have to think about when you are designing your application or writing your code, knowing that that you're going to be relying on production testing. Basically, you're going to be doing testing on local hosts using unit testing and so on. But after that, it's straight to production. What are some of the things that we have to think about if we are working in this sort of world?
I'll go first. Let me talk a little bit about how you might test locally differently, first of all, and then I'll go into the whole production thing, because a lot of people think of environments like staging or things like that as a place where they finally integrate everything and run everything integrated. The problem with that approach is that you really don't test thoroughly in that area. Typically, you can't really test. So whenever you get rid of those environments, though, you do want to test a running piece of software, a component or something like that. So this kind of leads you down a path of building up lots of mocks, lots of fakes or things like that, using something like WireMock if you're in the Java space and so on. So something where you can actually start up a component of software, rapidly do some exploratory testing through the front of that component, and quickly manipulate or change the data that's returned, etc. So that's one significant difference in the testing approach, is that you've got to get away from this mindset that you have to fully integrate everything and everything has to be running somewhere in order for you to thoroughly test it. So that being put aside, the first thing that I will say that is essential to be able to test in production is good feature toggles that can be turned on just for the team to test, so that I can turn it on for us. We could do some testing. We could be comfortable with it before we decide to roll over to it. The other thing that I'll throw out, and then I want to pass on to you guys because I've got a million ideas, but just the idea of being able to run multiple versions of the same software in production at the same time. So in other words, putting a new version out there and being able to test it and make the decision assumes that the old version is there and kind of running as well. And there's a lot of different strategies that you can use for that. Probably not enough time to go into all of those right now, but that's just a few concepts. Csaba, let me pass it over to you for a few more.
Yeah, so actually it's interesting that you mentioned exactly what I wanted to mention about APIs and versioning. Mm-hmm. Because one of the last question was at the beginning, what do we need to do? How do we have to think about architecture when we want to be able to do that? And I found that one of the biggest reasons, and I'm going to again touch on this staging environment. One of the big reasons people really are still clinging on to this staging environment, because they think that this is going to be the point where they can put these pieces together and everything, and they can prove that these pieces work together. Right now, the first thing for me is always that, are those pieces actually version-wise fit together? And usually when you are in your local environment, you know which version or which version should be able to fit together. So one question is, how can you test or check whether the right versions are deployed to production indeed? So maybe some level of monitoring or some level of of administrative kind of tooling, which can now do the same thing what you described, Cheezy, that where we know what version, run multiple versions, but we can also switch these, right? So there's some tooling out there which can do it for you. Some of them you have to do it yourself, depending on the tooling. But ultimately, all your APIs, all your pretty much all your components have to be able to tell what version they are. I know it's a very simple thing, but yet many large organizations don't have that, and which comes with the versioning scheme of what is really a different version. And we don't want to go into that, but versioning alone could be a huge topic.
Yeah, I'll build on something that you both said. Feature toggles are an obvious candidate, but what to do with those feature toggles? I think from a mindset perspective, I think when we start a new feature, drilling that mindset that the first thing you're going to do about this feature is create a toggle which turns it off, and then start writing your feature. Like that is such a shift for a lot of people when they start thinking about it in terms. So that is there, and I think hand in hand with that is the idea of some sort of canary release. Is that when you are deploying when you are releasing your software, you should be able to do it to a smaller subset of users. And I think this is where people sort of over-engineer the solution. They will immediately go for something very sophisticated, like a Google optimized product or some sort of population control product, when in reality, at the end of the day, all you're doing is diverting a set of users this way. And you can do that based on so many different things, IP address, some sort of cookie or what have you. You don't need a tool to do that. So I think sometimes people have a much higher imaginary starting cost to go down this road when it's actually fairly simple stuff that allows you to start on this path. And going back to the article that I mentioned at the start, I think the flat branching strategy is, I think we've talked about that in the past as well, I think we should clarify what we mean by that, because sometimes I think people take trunk-based development as meaning that there are no branches. Is that what it means, Cheezy?
To me, it does. Yes.
Okay, then. All right. Is that so? If you're a team on Git flow and you want to go to trunk-based development and hopefully on the path to just local host in production, do you immediately just kill off your branches and that's it? Or is there a stepping stone in between the Cheezy ideal and Git flow?
I think that there are some steps in between, and as I've helped companies make that transition, there are steps around, getting rid of the branch, but still keeping some sort of a development type branch, and that doing pull requests against that, then ultimately merging it into master, down to, from that point down to, hey, we do a pull request process onto master, or whatever, and do kind of a review process around that, step by step by step, so again, you can't introduce a lot of risk. And so the precursor to being able to do these things are more advanced testing practices, though, so that as we start to get rid of the risk of branching, we also, that means that that we speed up the timeline for things to make it to production. So if we have
let me push back on that just a little bit, and not necessarily push back, but give you another angle of this. So when we go from local host to production, I think it's fairly simple when you have, like, say, one UI and one service. Like, you can sort of coordinate that change pretty easily. And then in a situation where you have multiple services, and Csaba, to your point, where multiple services have multiple versions and there may not be the guarantee of backward compatibility, in those situations, I think that's where people want a particular version deployed before they go to production. How do you attack that particular problem? Because Csaba mentioned version control, which is easier said than done, especially if you're in a legacy environment, because version control means at some point versioning something somewhat deeper into your stack, which may not be feasible. Are there any tips around that particular challenge of multiple versions and no guarantee of backwards compatibility?
So now we're going to get a little bit into architecture. Thank goodness. So first of all, let me just say that we sort of have an industry standard around how do we catalog types of changes, and it's called semantic versioning, and that's something that has existed for a long time. Pretty much all dependencies that you're using right now follow that process. So that is kind of a given, and a lot
That's
of people,
that's a platonic ideal, though.
now hear me out, because that one, how so? How so?
Because I think it requires a lot of discipline for you to actually. I mean, semantic versioning, I agree with in principle. It makes complete sense. But in practice, I think people barely follow it. Barely. Like, they will bump the most easiest version to bump, not necessarily reflective of the change.
Well, that would be a place that's not really focused on delivering rapidly, because whenever we're talking about continuous delivery, it does require discipline, and the discipline to manage the right version is key, right? So we have that. We also have endpoint versions, which because you mentioned services, which is yet one additional layer, okay, that sits above that. And to be quite honest, I'm going to add another layer that gives even additional abstraction, which is adding an API gateway on top of that. And so, and hopefully the API gateway is programmable. Okay. And what I have done and what I have seen in the past is places where, there is a standard idea around how long will we support old versions of services, that pipelines themselves can move gateways, what gateways are pointing to. Pipelines themselves can create new versions based on major releases, etc. And where you have something like a contract test to give you early warning, a warning in development as well, that what you're about to do is going to have a major problem, or it's going to break somebody. And so during development, this is not necessarily in production, but in development, we can give an early heads up. If it is breaking, though, there is no risk of putting a new version out, as long as, again, we've got the new version. The existing version is there, at least for the period of our policy. We've created the new endpoint in the gateway. So I don't see any problem there whatsoever. And it's an incredibly low risk. Let's say the policy is that I have, the old version of my API is out there for a week. So now all of a sudden folks have a week to move up to the new version. And it does require discipline. It requires coordination. But I don't know of a better way. Csaba, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's all valid what you said. What I wanted to add, however, and again coming back to architecture, is how fine-grained your API should be. Because we've all seen those APIs which have like 50 parameters, right? Well, good luck versioning that, right? So because most likely every single change is going to impact it, right? And I love, Cheezy, what you mentioned about contract testing, because one of the main principles of contract testing is consumer-driven contract testing. That's actually the full extent, right? So technically, nothing is stopping you, if you're an API provider, to have a contract or some sort of a version of an API for various clients. Sorry, not version. When I say a version, like a type of an API for one of your clients, and then within that you can do some versioning. So ideally, not every single change should impact every single client, right? This is one of the bottom lines. And so that's what I would say, that fine grain your APIs to the extent that they make sense. Of course, you don't want every single field to be a separate API, because that's crazy again. But we've seen these super small micro APIs that really work. And again, we could go down into like certain other architectural patterns. But I think if you just try to service your clients, service your various consumers, I think that's a pretty good start.
Yeah, and I think I think this is the main challenge. The main challenge is the multiple services deployed at the same time and no guarantee of backward compatibility. I think observability can play a a big role here. And I want to distinguish between monitoring and observability, because I've noticed that those two terms are often used interchangeably. And there's some good articles I've read which basically argue that they are sort of the same. But I think it's helpful to differentiate it, because I think monitoring is something, just all the data, all the metrics of your application are being recorded somewhere. But I think observability is, I would say, the ability for the developer to actually go into production and quote unquote debug it. And I think this is where architecture comes in, especially because I think there needs to be a mechanism for developers to look at a live production application that is running and be able to instrument it, to observe certain API calls, or even change the value of certain calls to see what the behavior might be in production. Because how often have we, I think Csaba, I think you once said, like it takes us like 80% of time to actually figure out what the issue is and like 2% to fix it, right? So if that 80% can be collapsed by using good observability practices, the one that I recently used, and this is why I kind of proposed this podcast topic, was to actually have another. I was writing a Node app, and you had a bunch of handlers to process the request, and I wanted to see what was going on in production. So I architected it in a way where you have an additional handler where I can go in and basically intercept every call and modify it before it goes to the next. Like, it was a simple little hack that I did. No products used, just a little bit of code. And oh my God, the amount of feedback that I got on how the application was being used by real customers, and it was done without disrupting anybody, and I could rely on the data. But that only happened because I made the possibility of a particular handler that I would control in a live environment. Those are some of the things that I think can benefit developers if they're going down this approach. Cheezy, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to introduce another idea, though, that I think is kind of critical as well. So again, whenever we think about testing in production, what happens if we test and it's not good? So there is this idea of potentially shutting off or backing out something. And if we're using feature toggles, that's not that difficult to do, except it gets a lot more complex whenever we have databases. Okay. And so from an architectural perspective, I think that it's imperative that our pipeline manage and control our database, and that we follow an active record pattern. And I'm not going to go into the details around that, but a pattern that has the ability to make the change, migrate the data, and if we also want to, has the ability to revert as well. So that adds some complexity. The other architectural change or idea that I want to introduce around testing in production has to do with being able to, in production, being able to temporarily, while we're doing testing, point to something that's not real. So for example, let's say that I want to do some testing of a component, but maybe it's talking to an outside source or a third party or something like that. And I don't really have the ability to do the type of testing that I want. Hopefully I can do the overwhelming majority of that testing locally with a fake of some sort, or a mock of some sort. But I also have seen cases where we might want to do something a little bit broader in scope, and having the ability to slip a fake, I guess, if you will, even in production potentially. So that's another architectural thing to contemplate while you're doing this. Csaba?
Yeah, I wanted to add I just wanted to go back a little bit what Zarar said about observability, but I want to go back to monitoring, because and finding the bugs finding the issues takes a long time. One thing that I haven't seen in a long time in large systems, an easy way to trace some kind of like, think about a transaction, right? A client logs in,
Correlation ID.
That's exactly where I'm going with this, right? So something that I could literally follow, that client, from the moment it logged in, it's almost like getting a step by step what happened, and I don't necessarily need a crazy amount of details here, right? But to be able to follow that path of that client through this journey.
I think that builds on top of what Zarar was saying about observability, right? So being able to trace it through the system.
Yeah, exactly. And where I'm trying to go with this point is that we produce crazy amount of logs, right? And there are whole industries built on the top of interpreting and trying to mine meaningful information out of these logs. But we could also do something as developers and architecting, and to your Zarar, to your point, is these traceable IDs, and potentially build some very, very small tools ourselves that now can build this narrative for us. They can build this narrative for
I think where you're going with
developers.
this is Csaba, is sort of event-driven architecture, where you don't necessarily have to worry about creating a correlation ID and then passing it through your UI app over to your service. And then, because often it may be possible to do that. I think we used to do that way back. But I think modern systems are more going towards event-driven architecture, where you are able to replay a transaction accurately, and I think that gives you the correlation ID that you're referring to. But instead of saying, "Oh, this is the end. This was the previous state of the data," or "This is the new state of the data. What happened?" You sort of have all the events that ended up changing the data, so you can kind of almost rewind and see what happened. But again, I think that's completely an architectural thing. You can have all kinds of good practices from a team perspective, but if you don't have good architects who have designed your application that way, there's no chance of you doing that.
But I just would like to add one thing here, because I think this is the key, and I love it. Cheezy always says this, that in the moment when you wrote your first line of code, start thinking about these, because it will be very, very late when you have 1 million lines of code to start thinking about it, right? So if you start thinking about monitoring, if you start thinking about of course DevOps, if you start thinking about deployment, once your first line of code is written, you start thinking about this traceability. If you start, then every single step or increment of your product, it is going to incorporate this, right? And I think that's the key here, that whoever is listening to this, start thinking about this from day one, and not be an afterthought. Because I can tell you that once you're producing millions of lines of logs every minute, it's very, very hard to come back at that point and try to figure it out.
So I'll just add one other idea here real quickly. We're talking about testing in production, but that should not be your crutch, So I just want to say right up front that it is imperative that before you push something to production, that you have a lot of confidence that it works, and that it works well, that you've written lots of unit tests, that you've written tests that are maybe slightly larger than unit tests if you need to, that you've set up to do some exploratory testing around some perceived risk that you might have, that your pipeline handles the non-functional requirements that you have, and that by the time it gets to production, you really don't feel that there's a lot left, or that there's nothing left in the overwhelming majority of cases.
And I'll say that I think sometimes the branding of this idea is wrong, because we frame it as get rid of your staging environments, when in reality what we are doing is we are turning the developer workstation into a staging environment. And I think if you look at that, if you reframe what the new development setup is, I think you'd find that it's more beneficial. The biggest thing that people, especially backend developers, will kind of shudder is like, how do I know developer X's service is doing what I expected it to do because I call it? And obviously that requires team communication and all the things that Cheezy talked about with mocks. Anyways, we are out of time. This is our first podcast that is actually also on YouTube. So I don't know. I think we're looking good. I think we're okay.
And my hot water machine went off in the same time that boiled the water. So you guys will hear the music from that one as well.
Well, listeners, thank you for tuning in. Follow us on Twitter at @ContinuousPod. And we have a LinkedIn group as well, where we post the podcast and take your questions and so on. We'll see you again next week. Goodbye.